What is up, everybody? Merry Christmas and a happy holidays to everybody. This is the Sharp Angles podcast, the Thursday edition of the Sharp Angles podcast, which we do live over on YouTube every single Thursday, even even a Thursday after Christmas, in which neither of us probably feels very great. We'll have another one on January 2nd. We'll see how we recover from New Year's Eve at our advanced age here, but we're going to keep doing it every single Thursday, 11:30 a.m. Eastern over at YouTube. Go to YouTube, search Sharp Football Analysis, subscribe, get notified when we go live, all of that jazz. And the other person I'm talking about here, the other middle-aged man who probably cannot handle the late nights anymore either, is Mr. Rich Hribar. How you doing, Rich?
Doing good. I hope everyone had a really good holiday. Hopefully, a lot of parents didn't have to build a lot of things. Hopefully Santa pre-built those things before they were opened. That's always the optimal move. But if hopefully a lot of people didn't have to put a lot of stuff together. I always feel for those people.
Yeah, so it's funny.
Hope you had
I
enough
don't have any.
batteries.
The batteries, yeah. I don't have any kids, so our Sundays are very, very low key. We see the nieces and nephews at other times, but it was funny this year. I am not a big Christmas person. I don't really like receiving presents ever, and specifically not at Christmas. My wife loves Christmas, and so I always do the best that I can. Being a Grinch and still doing the best I can for Christmas, but she got me this year. I've wanted an ice cream maker for a long, long time. I love ice cream. It's my favorite thing in the world. But like real ice cream is so terrible for you, and I'm fat enough. And so I've always been trying to find all right, like I could make healthier ice cream with like nut milks and stuff like that. Don't come at me, seed oil folks. I'm sure you have some issues with nut milks, but like healthier healthier for me, which is just a step in the right direction kind of ice creams. And she hit me with the ice cream, but the one thing she didn't do is it's one of those where you need to like freeze the bowl ahead of time. It doesn't have its own cooling feature. You have to freeze the bowl, and that's how it works. Didn't freeze the bowl ahead of time. It was just a rookie mistake from my wife.
Yeah,
Calling her out here on the podcast. We could have had beautiful lemon golden Oreo ice cream for Christmas Day if she had just frozen it, but no, couldn't do it either way. It truly is, I think, the happiest I've been on Christmas since I was a kid. Like that's the one time I've ever gotten a gift. I go, yeah, I'm into this. How'd you come out? How'd you do?
Pretty good. Yeah, listen, anytime you get a new device, you always have that trial and error period, though. It's like where you messed it up and you're like, oh, I wasn't supposed to do that. You read 80% of the directions. You at least got like to where you needed to be.
80%.
And then you're like that little bit, you're like, oh, I was supposed to do that, or I was supposed to hit that button. I got a Bartesian this year.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
in the first drink I made, I popped a pod in and I make it, and I didn't lock the actual liquor button. So the first one I made was just with the syrup. It was just a syrup drink. And then I was like, what? I was like, why didn't this work? And then it's like there's one little button you have to push down for the straw to work on the for the liquor button. But yeah, it was a really dope gift though. It was really cool. Yeah. And Santa also brought my daughter Tyler the Creator tickets, which I also got a ticket to that too. So I kind of made out pretty good.
You're doing awesome. You're just living your best life out here. I like your idea that reading 80% of the instructions. Yeah. It's one of those differences between you and I. I've never touched an instruction in my life. I'm flying in blind, baby. Let's just see,
I don't have that gene, like the crafts. My dad wasn't like a handyman, so I never inherited like handyman skills. I can watch a YouTube video and follow. Like I can follow directions, but I don't have that gene. It's like, give me these two tools and I'll fix that. Like I have to watch a YouTube video and like go and work on it.
Those you can see the nerdy stuff behind me. Y'all are going to be shocked by this, but I've been building computers since I was a very small guy. And I remember early in my marriage, my wife came home and she said had been having trouble with her laptop not charging or whatever. And she came home with her laptop, an old laptop, from like 15 years ago, and just a million pieces on the table, and lost her mind. And I was like, no, I promise you it all went back together. And then look, it all went back together. I didn't need any instructions. I didn't need a YouTube video. Just fly by the seat of your pants. You'll be all right. Anyway, we went way down a rabbit hole on this week 17 podcast. Hopefully, if you're listening to this, you're still in your fantasy championships. If not, though, we do have a lot of DFS related stuff to talk about. And that's actually where I want to get started here, because we have these, I love short slates. I love the Christmas slate. Didn't quite work out I didn't have the guts enough to go 100% Xavier Worthy, and that ended up costing me a little bit. So didn't really hit on a Christmas, but I love these short slates. We have a 3-game one on Saturday, which is really interesting because of some of the kind of questions that it presents, especially if we end up with James Conner not playing, which I guess is kind of where I want to start here with running back. We've seen Conner practice, limited
Mhm.
practices, 2 straight days. That's, by the way, shocking to me. I don't know kind of where you came into the week. I came into the week not thinking we would see him this week,
Mhm.
especially with them eliminated from playoffs on a short week. So we'll have to still see what happens with James Conner. If Conner is ruled out, I mean, Benson's going to be the stone cold chalk. I bet we see a lot of 3 running back lineups. But if Conner is active and playing, suddenly we have 3 really good options at running back. And I think that would open up this slate quite a bit if we end up with a at least relatively healthy Conner, an active Conner in this game.
In general, the Cardinals Rams game is probably the most intriguing game, not just because
Yep.
of, it being the late game on the slate, but also it being just so different than when these teams played earlier in the season. I mean, I think even if Connor plays, he becomes relatively risky because we just don't know how healthy he is. Will he be limited, right? And
Yep.
then the
Yep. Yep.
Cardinals put both of their offensive tackles on IR. So
Yep.
they're not going to have either offensive tackle, Jonah Williams or Paris Johnson, in this game on Saturday night. So there's just a lot of things in the air with the Cardinals and these teams that get eliminated these final 2 weeks. So it is kind of, a tough spot to be in, if James Conner even does play, right? So if he's out, then it becomes a little easier. You get a little more clarity. Like if Benson's up and Connor's out, then we know you're at least going to get some workload. We're going to see what Benson has, which would seem to make a lot of sense, right? But hey,
Yeah.
the thing I always talk about when these players are at the end of the season, like these guys want to play. Like when people talk about
Yep.
why haven't they shut Brees Hall down? Because he's a football player. He really wants to play. Chris Olave might play this week. Like,
You've seen
people.
CeeDee Lamb play through this
Yes.
obviously very, very painful shoulder injury, and he keeps playing through it. Now, I mean, he was a DMP on Wednesday, although they're one of the many teams that I don't think actually practiced on Wednesday. And so we'll have to see what
Mhm.
continues on with CeeDee Lamb. But this is a very painful injury that he's playing through for no reason whatsoever because these guys want to play. They want to play
Yeah.
football. That's what they do, right? And
Yes.
so I think it's a good point to make.
Yeah, so if Connor wants, Connor has stated that the commentary was that he wants to play and wants to try to play, but the short week with that injury, it looked severe. It was a bummer because he was really cooking in that game like we expected.
Oh,
But yeah, this game though is intriguing, like I said, because the Rams, when they played this game earlier in the year and they got absolutely mopped in Arizona, they were missing 3 offensive linemen. They didn't have Puka Nacua. Cooper Kupp gets injured in the second quarter of that game. They were still starting Tre'Davious White at cornerback in that game. Their 2 rookie defensive linemen had yet to kind of really get ramped up. Like this game is going to be so inherently different. And you see that implied by the total and the spreads here.
yeah, and I mean, I think people are probably going to be excited about Kyler Murray because of the success he had in that game. But I think your point, this is a completely different Rams defense that he's going up against. It's a different level of defense than they were at that point. And we've now seen Kyler Murray do nothing in 2 good matchups in the
Yep.
last 2 weeks. And so I think Murray, I haven't seen any ownership projections. I tend to look at those after I've kind of made my decisions about who I like. But Murray seems like a pretty easy fade for me, knowing that there's an opportunity for this game to pop off. There's an opportunity for him always to have a 60 yards and a rushing touchdown. All of that exists. I'm not saying that Murray's definitely going to have a bad game, but I do think that people probably are going to view him more favorably than he should be based on what this Rams defense has been more recently and based on what we've seen from him in these last couple of otherwise good matchups as well. I also sit and look at Stafford. Stafford's the lowest price starting quarterback here, at least at DraftKings. And I don't know if he has the ceiling, especially what we've seen from the Rams the past couple of weeks, where they are very willing to, run
Yeah.
Kyron Williams a lot, and that's why Kyron Williams is going to be very popular, rightfully so, very popular, I think, on this slate. And so, if they're able to just run over the Cardinals, and the Cardinals ain't, especially coming off now a disappointing loss, being eliminated from the playoffs, are not really able to make this a game, then Stafford's probably going to have one of his floor games. And what is his ceiling really, especially when you're comparing him to somebody like Joe Burrow or even a Bo Nix in this situation? I'm not sure, but at least there is an opportunity for him there, lower price. So I think you're right. This is one of the more interesting games. That Cincinnati Denver game is also also very interesting. We could have bad weather. Like there's lots of things going on there in that game. But you would be excited about several pieces of it. I'll say the Broncos backfield though is like it's so fascinating. We have this short slate and we have a backfield you can't even touch because we have no idea what's going to happen in that backfield. We probably getting Jaleel McLaughlin back. We could get Tyler Beatty back this week at this point. Estime got the carries, but played way fewer snaps than Javonte Williams last week. Like it's just an absolute mess. And we have a couple of those backfields here. What if J.K. Dobbins comes back? What do we do? Running back is really interesting outside of those kind of top two guys. And that's why I assume we're going to see a lot of those top two guys on rosters and just everybody else trying to figure it out from there.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of Kyron Williams and Chase Brown loaded in on that.
Yeah,
I mean, even
lots.
last week, the Browns were never really threatening the Bengals outside of like the open of that game. And we did not even sniff Khalil Herbert in that game. I mean, now since Zach Moss got hurt, Chase Brown has 165 out of 170 backfield touches. Like,
that's pretty good. It's not bad.
Just an absurd workload. And he was a big workload guy at Illinois, like at that final year. He got a massive workload that season. So he can handle it too. So, I mean, since he's taken over that job, only Saquon Barkley has more yards per scrimmage per game than Chase Brown. So high workload guy. If there is weather stuff, Kevin Roth at Roto Grinders is the guy I follow. And he's like the only guy like I really trust for weather stuff. And he's waiting till kickoff, but it looks like there's going to be a lot of rain in that game. We'll have to wait till kind of, we see closer to kickoff, but there's potential to be just a lot of really heavy rain in that game, which could kind of throw some things into whack, but that just pushes Chase Brown's ownership like even higher in that game. So because the Broncos are really good against the run, but we have seen like on last Thursday night, like Gus Edwards pop a long run, get 2 short touchdowns. Just with a running back getting the workload that Chase Brown's getting, I mean, you're never really fading him because of matchup.
So we have those 2 running backs that are going to be very popular. And then, I mean, Trey McBride, even after this last game, because there's just who else? Like, who else? Are you going back to Will Dissly if Will Dissly plays, which it kind of seems like you
it's
will?
Like Hunter Henry.
Yeah, Hunter Henry. Are you hoping for Tyler Higbee, even after he ran 6 routes last week? Does a hobbled T. Higgins lead to more Mike Gesicki? Like, what are even your prayers here outside of Trey McBride? And so, yeah, maybe it might be one of those slates where you just have to eat the chalk and try to get unique off of that. Play some New England wide receivers, play some Denver wide receivers, hope for the best, right, and do it because like I don't know how you're really making a strong case for anybody outside Trey McBride as more than just like a hoping for a touchdown. Which, to be fair, Trey McBride doesn't score those, so maybe that maybe that'll be good enough. But it is a really interesting Saturday slate, and I will be paying a lot of attention to that as we move forward. Do you have a couple questions in the chat here? Talk about before we move on. Our week 17, our Super Bowl questions here. One from Brad. What 2 should I take? DJ Moore versus Seattle, Ladd McConkey versus the Patriots, and Zach Charbonnet versus the Bears. This has questions in here about players playing on Thursday night, tonight, when we're recording this, playing on Saturday. Definitely going to answer this. I will say your last live chat of the year will be on Sunday for Sharp Football subscribers. You can get on to our weekly package for 80% off using promo code SHARP80. That'll give you access to Rich's subscriber only chat on Sunday morning. Ask all your questions, get ready for the fantasy Super Bowl. It's definitely a major benefit of our all access subscription. So make sure you check that out. This question from Brad. I mean, I think Charbonnet is a very clear one here for this answer, but the receivers, that's a little bit closer. So I'm gonna default to you on that one.
Yeah, I think McConkey's a pretty tough sit at this point, just because the floor and upside he's had, and then you get some matchup kind of nuggets for him too in this game. He's got really strong splits against man coverage this season. Against man coverage, he's been targeted on 29% of his routes for 3.4 yards per route run, compared to 20.5% of his routes against zone coverage for 2 yards per route run. Patriots are a top 5 man defense. He also plays in the slot nearly 70% of his snaps. If you're a big cornerback wide receiver guy, he will avoid Christian Gonzalez for a large chunk of his opportunities too. So I would lean there in that game. The Thursday night game is interesting too. We won't go crazy because it'll be over and like this, as an evergreen content, because the Bears actually used their highest rate of play action last week in their game against the Lions and we talked about it coming into the Seattle matchup for Sam Darnold as a better bounce back spot than maybe people assumed, that because the amount of play action the Vikings run, and he was really successful with the play action pass in that game in Seattle. So do the Bears continue to use that play action and keep that same rate that they had last week? Because then they can have success in that Seattle matchup and maybe open up some stuff there in that matchup for DJ Moore and Keenan Allen and some prayer yards for Roma Dunze. But you always have to place that faith in, are the Bears going to keep doing something that worked and do the optimal thing?
Actually, I was going to mention, we'll talk about this here in a second, but the Lions gave up 6.5 yards per play to the Bears last week. The Bears, they scored 17. They lost some fumbles, although those weren't really long drives before they lost the fumbles. They lost it on downs later in the game, but the Bears kind of moved the ball last week, which is a question about, is that them? Is that the Lions defense and kind of where it's been? I guess we'll find out more about that this week when the Lions play the 49ers, with all of their injuries. But yeah, they moved the ball a little bit last week. I think that's worth mentioning. One more here. It's in the same vein. We've got need two from McConkey, Neighbors, and Charbonnet. It's almost as if people that drafted McConkey ended up in the Super Bowl, the fantasy Super Bowl. There we go. The only new name we have there is Neighbors, so I guess it's Neighbors versus McConkey. Neighbors has a toe injury. I believe he was DNP on Wednesday, if I'm remembering correctly. But I mean, this feels like the same two people would be your answer here as well. Any overarching thoughts about Neighbors?
No, I mean we're on the same Neighbors plane, right? Like he's gonna get a lot of targets, and just depends on if you have any type of upside at those targets. I mean he leads the NFL in targets per game, but the thing is he's like 115th, I think, in yards per reception. Like he stacks like 8-yard catches. That's kind of like the MO, and you get a bunch of those. So in like a full PPR league, that's like still floor based, and you have opportunities there. I think probably the most interesting piece is probably Charbonnet, right? Like we want to start Charbonnet. The question is, do we have the same run out with Charbonnet that we had in previous times that Kenneth Walker was out? We did see the last week he was out, Kenneth Walker that is, in that Sunday night game against the Packers. Charbonnet luck boxed into like a late touchdown run and didn't really have like high usage in that game. They got kind of flooded. We expect them to be in positive to neutral game script at worst in this game on Thursday night, which opens up the door to have more opportunities than he had in that Packers game where they were just trailing like immediately. So you get those opportunities against this Bears defense that they have just been terrible against the run. So like you kind of have to just chase that implied game script and that game environment, leading to just more opportunities for Charbonnet against a team that's been so bad against opposing backfields. And like, I wrote some stuff in the worksheet, you can check it out, just look at the last 6 games of the Bears against these running backs. So I do think Charbonnet becomes like a guy like that could be like, he has potential to be like a really top like 6-ish running back with a ceiling on the week, and then he's just like a floor-based guy at his floor. So I do like him a lot. McConkey versus Neighbors is a little closer, but I still have McConkey higher for the reasons that we kind of talked about to open. I think there's just more upside for him.
So on Charbonnet, he was a little bit limited last week.
Mm-hmm.
We saw Kenny McIntosh, get involved in that game. He entered that game with an injury. He was on the injury report again this week with an elbow, but he was a full participant in the final 2 practices. So I think he's probably fine. I think we're going to get back to that kind of workload. But to your point, it is definitely a concern. All right, let's move on and do some real or fake. I don't know with this first one how to really coach it as a real or fake kind of question, but it's just simply thinking about the Eagles offense without Jalen Hurts. We're assuming we're not getting Jalen Hurts again. Like, this is early week assumptions. We know even less about injuries this week on a Thursday morning than we do in normal weeks, because Wednesday was Christmas, and there's a lot of uncertainty about how much, were there some games played on that Wednesday injury report. But with Jalen Hurts coming back from this concussion, I think the safe assumption is we're not going to see him. And if you kind of watch that game with Kenny Pickett, the Eagles offense was able to move a little bit, but like that was like penalties. It was defensive pass interference. They had some good field position. Overall, that offense just wasn't very good with Kenny Pickett there. To be fair, Pickett was, thrown into that game without proper prep, so maybe you give some benefit of the doubt there. But I think there's a lot of reasons to be very worried about what we're going to get out of AJ Brown, Devonta Smith, and then especially Saquon Barkley, because they really struggled to run the ball after Jalen Hurts left, as that defense just wasn't scared at all of Kenny Pickett. So I think there are lots of reasons. Even in this matchup, it's a decent matchup, especially for Saquon. There's lots of reasons for concern here about these Eagles fantasy stars.
Yeah, I think there's some concern, but Saquon Barkley, what are you going to do, right? You're always just going to take the
Sure.
touches and look for
It's
the
more of a
upside run.
it's more of a DFS
Yeah,
question than anything
pay
else.
up for Saquon and DFS slate. Yeah, absolutely. With the kind of the small sample size of that game, I mean, he ran 22 times for 41 yards after the first quarter of that game on Sunday, which becomes interesting, I think, also to bring up for the Sunday night game with Bijan Robinson, right? I'm pretty sure Dan Quinn might have a similar approach where he wants Michael Penix to beat him in the same way that they wanted Kenny Pickett to try to beat them in that game, for the final three quarters. So that becomes kind of interesting because that's on paper, just a stellar spot for Bijan Robinson, but also it's a totally different game environment than what Michael Penix had for his first start. So that becomes an interesting wrinkle that when you look at Washington, they boxed Saquon the final three quarters of that game for under 2 yards per carry. He had 8 or more defenders in the box for almost 60% of his runs after the first quarter. And on those runs with the loaded box, 13 carries for 18 yards. So you're going to take always the kind of the touches and just kind of see what you get with Saquon. But there definitely is maybe some concern that, without Jalen Hurts, this offense just isn't as effective. I will say it does become interesting because I don't think Kenny Pickett's better for AJ Brown and Devonta Smith in the sense of getting quality targets, but there's an outcome here where with Kenny Pickett starting, it actually ends up being okay for these guys to get a lot of targets just because they're probably not going to run away with this game now or completely flood them like they did the first matchup. And we saw AJ Brown in that game on Sunday. He got 60% of the targets. Also, Kenny Pickett threw the ball 22 times at players. 20 of them went to those two guys. So there's a chance here because we've been doing the cat and mouse game with these Eagles pass catchers forever where it's dude, they're going to get 8 targets. What are you going to do with 8 targets? We know that the ceiling's capped in terms of targets. They've just got to be hyper efficient. Now we kind of have a little bit of a leeway and say man, AJ Brown could have got a 15 target. He could have a 15 target game Sunday. Absolutely exists in the range of outcomes. So I actually think Kenny Pickett's involvement becomes a little bit interesting for the pass catchers from a DFS stance. Are we going to run some Kenny Pickett doubles maybe? Does that exist as a potential outcome? Because I think he's going to throw the ball at these two guys basically ad nauseum, and they're probably going to have 2 of their higher target games than we've seen with Jalen Hurts.
You talk about a showdown degenerates, and then you're running out Kenny Pickett doubles to us.
When a guy gets a 60% target share, I'm looking.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm with you. I would just probably leave Kenny Pickett out of that, but so I think that's fine. But you could maybe even have both of them and no Kenny Pickett. You're right about kind of the way that it was targeted, and I mean it was how many of those targets were just slants, just pure slant routes, just even the interception we saw, Frankie Louvu just kind of know what was coming because that's kind of what they were doing, and so it was he might just throw it to them 30 times, might be forced to throw it to them 30 times. I do think that's a fair point that we're going to get less, I would assume, we're going to get less efficiency than we normally would, but maybe just kind of play volume, which we've really been hurting for, especially in the second half of these Eagles. Maybe that's something that kind of still gets you there with those guys if you're forced to use them. Another interesting kind of spot here that is more interesting after the Chiefs won on Christmas Day is the Buffalo Bills with now, they can't get the number 1 seed. They're still not technically locked into the number 2 seed because the Ravens won. They still need another win to really lock that up. But now we're at the point here where we have to start to question, with really not much to play for here for Buffalo, going up against the Jets, real or fake, I guess you can trust the Bills this week.
I mean, it's tough with the Bills. They're always a tough team from a fantasy stance because you always, we play Josh Allen forward first. We know they somehow by hook or crook are going to flirt with 30 points, but they rotate all their players. And we've seen that when the Bills have all their pass catchers healthy, that Khalil Shakir and Dalton Kincaid are the top 2 target earners. And neither one of those guys are very inspiring per target. in terms of like how they produce. They both need a lot of targets to kind of get there for fantasy football, and it's tough. And then you've got the James Cook factor, who just, has done the complete inverse James Cook, fantasy production that he's had his first 2 years in the league. I mean, he leads the NFL in rushing touchdowns now.
Can we actually talk about that for a second? Like, because there was a time, it's like week 3 or whatever. It might have even been week 1 where I said, "Oh, James Cook got a goal line carry. We're in." Where we thought that, oh, this is about to be no David Montgomery, Jahmyr Gibbs. Is about what we're about to get out of James Cook, and then he just turned into, keeping with Lions running backs, he just turned into like 3 years ago Jamal Williams, right? Like that's kind of where we ended up with it. It's just so funny that we thought, all right, if the touchdowns come, and he's been a good fantasy player, I'm not saying that, but if the touchdowns come and we get these yards still, we're talking like, oh yeah, this is like running back number 1 overall kind of stuff. And it's just funny that never, we got the touchdowns, we got what we wanted, and that type of consistent production never showed up for him, which is just, it's fascinating that this is kind of where we are with this team and with this offense. Like you say, it's still one of the best offenses in the league, and this is still where we are with this guy when we got exactly what we wanted from him. It's really a very odd fantasy situation, this entire Bills team.
And Cook in general, like his usage stuff is all the same as last year. Like his attempts per game, his catches per game, like that's the one thing that's kind of thwarted him from being just like an elite running back, because that it almost was we're closer getting that than probably people realize. It's just like if he would have had like another like 4 to 5 touches per game like on his resume, and Josh Allen didn't have like the rushing touchdowns that he had, he could have really flirted it. But like he hasn't been like an amazing pass catcher, and that's kind of like the one thing that's like held him back. We still see like Ty Johnson rotate in, and that's just the Bills pass catchers in general. It's just a very flat, diverse, kind of target tree outside of Kincaid and Shakir. I will say though, like if the Jets don't have Quinnen Williams again, that is another like pro spot for James Cook. But James Cook's a guy like everyone's starting just anyways, right? Like he's just in. So I think when you're to your question, like the ancillary guys, like what are you doing with like Shakir? Like because we talked about him getting the targets, but like he's not like an exciting start per se. He gets like those targets, but he needs those touchdowns to kind of get there. He basically operates as like a floor-based option. It's not super exciting. He does get a little bit of a matchup leverage because, he plays inside the slot where, Sauce and DJ Reed, for as bad as the Jets have been, they're still really good against outside wide receivers and like have been for the entirety of the season. And then like Dalton Kincaid is essentially like, he's like Zach Ertz, dude. Like it's crazy. It's like a real bummer that like it turned out there because he was a relatively high draft pick. When you think about those early round tight ends, the ones that worked out, it was essentially basically McBride as like a floor-based play and Kittle. And then like everyone else was really disappointing in that area of the draft this year. It's been really cool to like kind of revisit that or to see what happens. Because I've seen some people flirt with like Brock Bowers being like a 2nd round pick next year. And it's like, oh man, are we doing the same thing again?
I'm going to be very interested I'm going to need to see what the quarterback situation is before I'm completely on board with that. Although I do very much love some Brock Bowers. I think that this is on us in the last week, just not talking enough about it. We went right past the Ty Johnson 114-yard receiving against Detroit. We went just right past that more than we should have, especially since they had like 55 yards, I think, and a touchdown the week before. And then obviously came back last week and had like 20 yards or something like that. But yeah, it's just, that's one of those performances. You go through the year and you kind of look at like at the end of the season, I'll start, going through game logs and making sure I'm where I'm supposed to be with all of these players as we start thinking about, off-season previews and things like that. And that's going to be one of them where I look at and I just see his random whatever 170 yards receiving in 2 games explosion and just go like, why? Where did that come from? Are there any other guys? Can you think of any other guys? Like, are we Westbrook Akine scoring just like 1,000 touchdowns? Is that going to be on the list too? Who are some other guys that were just confused about, like, just are confusing? Like every time you look at their game log, you're like, where did this game come from? You have any in your mind?
No, I'd have to think about. Not off the top of my head, like that just like stands out. But there's definitely more out there for sure. When you get listen, last week like old media's a chaos. We ain't gonna see that again. I know that. Like that's not one we're gonna
It's
see repeat itself, for sure.
It's
But
funny
there's
because like we could just pick the same receiver cores like over and over again, like Denver, Washington, and
yeah,
New England. Just several. Remember the Kendrick Bourne game? Do you remember when that happened? And like you didn't even pick the best Commanders receiver. At least Zacchaeus has been kind of playing snaps and running routes. Jameson Crowder caught two
yeah, James
touchdowns in
Crowder.
that game. Like, what what are we doing? Yeah, it's always fun. Yeah, producer Matt in the chat, our good friend Kayshawn Booty, who whenever
Yeah.
you recommend him in Uncut Gems doesn't do anything, but then catches the touchdowns when you don't. One more here, real or fake, before we move on, talk about a few of these games. Deebo Samuel is back, baby. Real or fake?
No, I mean, not back in the sense of like you're just gonna lock him into like being like a top 15 wide receiver. No, but he was always getting the opportunities. It was one of those things that's like he's a better football player than the production's been at, and eventually he was going to run into an opportunity, right? And unfortunately, I think a lot of gamers that had Deebo Samuel did not receive points on Sunday. But if you were, then you got him. Like it was a spot where we said like, yeah, begrudgingly. We were in the Sunday chat and I had a couple of Deebo questions and it was like Deebo versus Alexander Madison. I remember specifically. And I was like, there's just no way I'm going to go into I'm going to have the fantasy title on the line and play Alexander Madison over Deebo. Madison did score a touchdown, by the way, but I was like, there's just no way I'm going to live with myself. Like,
Where were you for me when I played Patrick Taylor over Devo in a league and lost by like 2 points? Where were you for me there when I talked myself out of winning by just pure fear? That's I think that's the dumbest one I've done all year. If we're doing hits or misses, we might do that next week, hits and misses. I might just put that on there, me playing Taylor over Devo, because I think it's one of the dumbest things I've done in fantasy, which is saying something for me. Because I do lots of dumb things. That is that is saying something for sure. I think your point about it is that the opportunities were there. I do think that's true, but like he has
I
more
get it.
targets,
Yeah.
Juwan Jennings now over the last 2 games. So I do think there have been slightly more opportunities. He had the 5 carries against the Dolphins. If we get Garindo back this week, then maybe that's not there as much. I do think there's interesting. I want to hear your thoughts on this. Traditionally, we've seen Debo be more effective and earn more targets against zone than versus man. That has not been the case this year. Obviously, small samples all around, but I do think that that's an interesting part of this. And I also think if you look at Debo's history against the Lions, it's not as big as you would expect. This Aaron Glenn version of the Lions, one of the games was all the way back in 2021, and so
Oh,
I
I
don't know how
remember
much
the
you're putting
one
into
game. I think
that.
it was week 1 where he went nuclear on them.
It's 9, 189, and 1. That's what
I
that
remember
was.
that
Like
game.
it
That was
just
the big breakout Deebo year.
Yeah, I know he just went wild in that game. But then you look at the playoffs last year, which obviously that's more interesting for our purposes here. He's 8 for 89, 30% target share. And so we know what the Lions do. We know they play a lot of man, but maybe you would look at his traditional splits and think maybe this isn't a spot for him, but that hasn't exactly been the case this year. I don't know if you've noticed that or have any thoughts on that from the worksheet.
No, I mean, the one thing with Deebo in general, the one bugaboo for him, and it's really been the largest problem that he's had this year, is that he just doesn't get end zone targets. And it's gone on his whole career. I think this year he only has 2 targets in the actual end zone. And I think he's had lower than 5 every year of like the last 4 years. That's like been the one thorn, because if he's not, breaking those tackles, like that touchdown he had last week, well, that was like a vintage Deebo touchdown. That was how he scores. 3 dudes can't tackle him. He's bouncing off a guy and he's playing bully ball. That's like how he's had to score his touchdowns. And we haven't had the splash plays. The 49ers are dead last in the NFL in touchdowns scored outside of the red zone this year. And it's really wild because they have a high rate of explosive plays, right? Like they just haven't linked up. I think they're actually second in the NFL in rate of 20-yard pass plays, like per drop back, but they only have 3 long touchdowns all year. So that's like something we'll probably see. And regression works in mysterious ways. Like we knew like the 49ers were a high regression team, and sometimes it just comes for you in weird ways. Like it's not always like the Cowboys, right? Where like everyone falls off the table. So that's always in play. We'll see. But this game on Monday night, I think if you have the 49ers guys, we're going to see something similar, even if Isaac Grendo plays. I think we're going to see a lot of dropbacks. They had their highest dropback rate in a game on Sunday. I don't think they're going to be able to really run the football on the Lions. Even for as many injuries as the Lions have, they've been really good against the run still. They had the one game and the one hiccup against Buffalo, but then you look at like over like their past 6 weeks, they faced a lot of good running backs and they haven't given up any production to those guys. They faced Josh Jacobs, Jonathan Taylor, Joe Mixon, DeAndre Swift twice, which you guys, you can question how good those guys are, but like they allowed fewer than 4 yards per carry to all of those running backs. So I don't think the 49ers are just going to line up and run the football on the Lions. I think it's been a high drop back game. And you kind of hinted on it with the Bears and the success they had in 2 of these games. The past month, the Lions, we've seen the injuries in the back end catch up to them. They have a lot of league high 8.7 yards per pass attempt, 23rd in touchdown rate. I think the 49ers have a huge drop back game on Monday night. Now, are they going to have like a oodles of production? Like, maybe not, but like all of these pass catchers are I think live in that Monday night game. I think the Lions are going to still score their points because they scored 31 in the playoffs against the 49ers last year, which was a better version of this 49ers team.
Yeah, it's definitely not the game ESPN hoped it would be because, the 49ers are out of it, but I'm still, pretty excited about this game on Monday night from a showdown perspective and all of that from DFS. I think it's going to be a fun game with a lot of avenues to attack a higher scoring game. So I am, I'm very interested in that. Let's move on and talk about a few of the other bigger games from the week. Before we do, just a reminder, make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube. Head over to YouTube, search Sharp Football Analysis. You'll get notified whenever we go live. Also, we're going to keep going through the playoffs, Rich's worksheet previews, which you'll see on the screen here in a second if you're watching on YouTube. And we reference throughout previews every single fantasy relevant player in every single game every week. Those are going to continue into the playoffs. You play playoff DFS. Those will be worth their weight in gold for that. We'll continue our betting packages through the playoffs. We've traditionally done very well in the playoffs. We're having a good year overall already. So, all of that's available to you. And you can get our weekly package, which continues on into the playoffs. You can get our weekly package for 80% off using promo code SAVE80. Sorry, excuse me, Sharp80. Excuse me, Sharp80. So make sure you go and check that out. The biggest game of the week to me, I think it's pretty clear. Packers at Vikings. Packers actually 1-point road favorites in this game, which is interesting given where we are. At least that's what it was when I was looking at my notes earlier today. 48.5-point total. And I think from a fantasy perspective, the real question for this game is, can the Vikings offense push the Packers to throw the ball? Because if we're going to reach maybe the fantasy heights we want to reach, I think that's probably the first question we have to answer.
Yeah, like Cardinals Rams, this game is a little bit different. We're in a different place with this matchup than we were when these teams played back in week 4. That was a game where Jordan Love was just coming back from the knee injury. The 2 starts, Malik Willis had started the previous 2 games. Jordan Love was completely rusty and terrible in that game. Like the first 3 quarters, he got there for fantasy because he had like a bunch of garbage time production in the 4th quarter while that game was way out of hand. And we've seen since the bye, I mean, the Packers have found their identity. Like they want to play like the McVay style ball, like that they want to run the football first forward, put Jordan Love in optimal spots to run play action, take downfield shots, and kind of work that way. Now, are they going to be able to do that against the Vikings is the question. They faced a lot of opponents since the bye that they were able to stay in neutral game script and run the football on. Are they going to be able to do that here? This Vikings team has had the top-down defense has been really good against the run and backfields, but we have seen them give up some rushing production as well over the course of the season, even the back half of the season a little bit. So are they going to be able to push the Packers out of what has become their identity? That's like the first thing, right? And like you said, one way they can do it is, are they scoring points? They are in a position to kind of do the same thing that they did last week, facing a similar defense that has really wonky splits against play action and non-play action passing. The Packers go on non-play and play action passes. They're 6th in the league in yards per pass attempt. They go 23rd in the league on play action passes. We've also seen that 2 of the quarterbacks have had a lot of, success against the Packers over the back half of the season. Jared Goff and Tua, like, kind of are in similar systems and structurally like operate how Sam Darnold operates this season. So are the Vikings going to have success? I do believe the Vikings are going to have success, especially indoors. So I do think the Vikings are going to be able to push them. It's, can they get the Packers, out of this run game and kind of get this game environment kind of juiced up and get them throwing the ball? Because we've seen the Vikings too. They'll give up passing volume, So like like Geno Smith last week, they've allowed 300 passing yards, I think, in 3 of their past 5 games. One was Caleb Williams. So this game has a high outcome indoors. Like it's definitely an exciting game when you're talking about like range of outcomes, because I do think the passing pieces here could have relatively all high ceilings in this game.
Yeah, I mean, that's if your answer to that question is yes, they can push them to do that, then suddenly you have a lot more interesting situations in the Green Bay receiver room. Like we saw Jaden Reed on the back of a couple long catches get to a respectable spot last week. But I think we're retiring. I think you're right. I tried to shoot you down a couple weeks ago, but I think we're retiring that we were wrong about Jaden Reed. I think we've come all the way back around to us being right about our concerns about Jaden Reed. But this could be, if now they are forced to throw a little bit more, we see more 3 wide receiver sets, which means we see him on the field more in this matchup that I think sets up reasonably well for him, that this could then be a Jaden Reed spot. And so like the fall off of that, if you're trying to like handicap this game, not from like a betting perspective or from like a fantasy perspective, and what I'm going to do for it from DFS, if you're building DFS lineups, then you just build lineups based on both outcomes, right? But if you're just trying to like build one lineup and you want to use parts of this game, you ask that question, and then after you ask that question, whatever your answer to it is, my lean would be yes. I think the Vikings are going to force them out of their shell a little bit. Then you suddenly start to get very interested in Jaden Reed. You can maybe even, depending on what happens with Christian Watson's knee, get interested with Dontavian Wicks again and try to run that gambit again, which I know I'm just setting myself up for hating myself, but that's where we are. And that's kind of the interesting game within a game here if we're talking about DFS for this contest. I think yes, and so I think I'm actually going to use a lot of Jaden Reed this week. I assume, I try not to look at ownerships until I've decided what I'm going to do. I don't know how popular that's going to be based on what we've seen from this Packers offense recently, but it is just, I think, a very interesting spot for him.
Yeah, Jaden Reed definitely is one of my more favorite players. I mean, you have to play the game script game with him. Like you got to get the right game environment, like you said. But this matchup is absolutely tailor made for him. I mean, he's destroyed this matchup in his short tenure with the Packers. But it makes sense. The Vikings are 31st in points allowed per game to slot receivers. They play a ton of cover two, which has always benefited Jaden Reed and where he works over the middle of the field. So yeah, I mean, Jaden Reed's definitely on my point. My biggest DFS week this season was when these teams met earlier in the year, and I was on Jaden Reed in that game. So I feel obligated to run it back.
Yeah, you definitely got to run it back. I'm going to be very excited when I have a bunch of like Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks with Jordan Love lineups, and Romeo Dubs catches 3 touchdowns, or Tucker Kraft. Tucker Kraft randomly gets loose for a 60-yard touchdown, as Tucker Kraft is wont to do. Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head how many touchdowns to tight ends the Vikings have given up this year. It can't be more than like 2 or 3. And isn't Kraft one of them? And
Yep,
so like
Kraft's
that's
one.
yeah, so there we are. That'll be interesting. On the other side, I mean, we know what we're getting from Justin Jefferson, right? We know who he is. Jordan Addison's target share, even though he didn't have the best game this past week, his target share has been right there with Jefferson, and so you know what you're getting from him. I think if you're looking for interesting kind of outs here for the Vikings passing game, you're really looking towards TJ Hawkinson, and we haven't gotten a ton from him, obviously coming back from a serious injury. You have any thoughts on him this week? Or are we maybe setting up here for a breakout?
I mean, you could point to it for the matchup and say that this is a spot, Packers, way they funneled targets to tight ends, and you can play that game. It's just Hawkinson's hurt by 2 things. One, like obviously the injury run out, and injury optimism has killed a lot of fantasy gamers. And we just have to, again, I always take like the pessimistic side on these types of guys, even though it was the tight end position, he was just a guy that wasn't on my draft board this season. And then the other thing that's hurt him, like you said, is just Jordan Addison has sustained a higher target share than he did last year. As a rookie, Jordan Addison was completely dependent on who was in and out of the Minnesota lineup. And that just hasn't been the case this year. He has established himself as kind of that locked in secondary option in the offense, similar to like what Jameson Williams has done with the Lions. Very similar spot. Like Jameson Williams, we've seen over the back half of the season have just a consistent target share weekly. And that's where Jordan Addison has been in this Vikings lineup. So those are the 2 things that hurt him. Now it's tight end. I have no problems like throwing that dart. It's just one of those things like, yeah, like I'm not anticipating it. It just doesn't exist in the range of outcomes.
User Matt reminds me that AJ Barner also scored against the Vikings
Last
last
week.
week. Tight end AJ Barner, another player. If I had just played him in that league where I started where I started Taylor over Deebo Samuel, I would have won that matchup. I'm not bitter about it. I'm not upset at myself for all of the terrible decisions I made or anything
We were right about all
like
the
that.
running backs, though, that we walked through last week. We were very hesitant on Taylor outside of you putting him in your own lineup. We were very hesitant on Taylor and Kendra Miller, even though people were excited.
Yeah.
I got a lot of questions in the Sunday chat about those two guys. And, obviously Jerome Ford being the other one. We called Jerome Ford to a T. Like, it's like you're going to hope for one big run. And for Jerome
And there you
Ford, he
go.
got it. He started the game with it.
Yeah, no, I put Jerome Ford first in the waiver wire that
Yep.
week, and I didn't feel great about it because, like, you need the long run, but at least that out exists, and
Yeah.
there we are. Kendre Miller not playing for Sims. I don't even know what Sims's first name is.
The
Uh,
Jordan Mims.
I don't know who it was, even in the backfield there for the Saints, but here we are. Here we are with Kendre
Yeah.
Miller, continue to pour some out. Dennis Allen just sitting giddy at home with Kendre Miller failing on national television. He's never been happier. It's the greatest Christmas present that Dennis Allen has ever gotten. All right, I want to move on to talk about the Falcons at Commanders, another very interesting game. Do you have a question in here? Do I drop DJ Moore, Zach Charbonnet, or Jordan Addison for Brian Thomas Jr., or keep everybody mentioned? I mean, first of all, why is Brian Thomas Jr. on the waiver wire? Did someone get mad they lost their semifinal game and just dropped their whole team? Is that what we're looking at? I mean, we're in the last week, so whoever you would rather start is who you'd rather have, and I think you would rather start Thomas Jr. over any of the receivers available there. I don't know, Jordan Addison versus DJ Moore, what your kind of thoughts are there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the like what is the led to this equation or whatever. Brian Thomas Jr. is a wide receiver one in fantasy.
You, yeah, no, you want him either of those other two guys. Um, that's hard. I guess. Do you know who you have ranked higher, DJ Moore or Jordan Addison there?
I think that's a classic, I think, ceiling versus floor thing. Like
Yeah.
if you like are just looking for like maybe like 8 to 12 PPR points, DJ Moore is pretty locked into that. But I think if you're looking for like more upside or like a multi-touchdown game, like then Jordan Addison. We just talked about that game environment potentially getting there indoors. Like that game environment's definitely a lot better. And I definitely am cognizant of like game environments more this year, especially when we're talking about range of outcomes. I wish I would have been a little bit better of it. Like we had one a couple weeks ago. We talked about Kyler versus Goff when Goff was playing the Bills, and like we both like Kyler's matchup, but it was like, man, like if this Bills game gets there, like that, like the game environment just is set up to explode way better than this individual matchup. And sometimes that game environment's enough to propel these huge scores. And I just think that Packers Vikings game is a game I definitely just want parts of.
Yeah, I think that's fair. All right, let's do Falcons at Commanders. The Commanders 4.5 point favorites at home, 48.5 point total. You kind of talked about some Bijan Robinson concerns earlier. Do you want to expand on those a little bit? Just if maybe they try to take him out of the game and get Michael Penix, make him beat him. Is that, that was kind of I guess the theory of the concern, right?
Which I believe was what we'll have to see happen, right? Like, it was a great conditions to give Michael Penix his first start, at home against the Giants team, down their best pass rusher this season. They even had a banged up Brian Burns coming into that game. Huge home favorites. We knew that they were in their back pocket, were going to be able to run the football in that game at minimum. And they were able to just kind of create a nice, cozy, comfortable game environment for Michael Penix to make his first start. He was pressured on not only 9 of his dropbacks in the game, just really easy. And his receivers boned him a few times. Like he had the highest drop rate in the league last week, 11% of his players with drops. And London dropped one too, a touchdown.
Fair enough. But Kyle Pitts volleyballed
he
the
handed
ball
one off.
Kyle, man, you're killing us. Those of us who just want to believe, Kyle Pitts, you're killing us. What was that? That was just it's been over for a long time, but I wanted to believe that might have been my breaking point. Him just setting the ball to
it's like he pitched it to him like a little
he underhand he Travis Kelce'd it to the defender. Sorry, that one got me. That might have been my breaking point. Sorry, Kyle.
But no, I just think that this game environment is going to be a lot different for Michael Penix in his second start. Going on the road against a team that is obviously in an exciting, playoff mindset, right? Like the Commanders are coming off of like a huge home win against the Eagles. Like this fan base has to be feeling like this team's real, right? Like this is going to be a totally different environment. I mean, Dan Quinn is a really good defensive head coach. I'm sure he's going to have some stuff down. Look what he's done to that defense. We opened the season like the first 3 weeks, like up, same Commanders defense. Like we're going to pick on these dudes every week. And they've had their moments where they've given up a lot of production. The run defense still isn't great, but by and large, like this defense has overachieved the personnel. And I believe we have to give Dan Quinn some credit for that, right? Like, who else were we going to give it to? The pass rush is actually really good. He's going to be under duress more than he was in that game on Sunday. And even when the very few snaps he was under pressure, I mean, he was under 3 yards per pass attempt under pressure. So I do think we're going to see something similar where Dan Quinn wants to see Michael Penix beat him. And if he can prove that, then, we're going to have a really good game environment. But if he does struggle, then this is going to be a game where it's probably the Commanders doing their like game control thing and kind of moving the ball. Also, Jaden Daniels cashed those tickets. If you bet on him, that was it last week. It's over. Like it's locked in. It was over a while ago, but some people were flirting with Bo Nix potentially winning Rookie of the Year. It's over now.
No, I mean the Broncos offense. I was on the Broncos as we know early in the offseason, but I was on the Broncos for the defense, which has turned out to be very good. From an offensive perspective, they've had their moments, and I think Bo Nix has been better than people expected him to be, which was always odd because the concern you had about Bo Nix was not the present. It was that how much higher can he go because he played college football for I think 12 years. It's somewhere around there. He was there for a very long time. But yeah, like this was always Jaden Daniels, like you said. What we saw last week locked it up for sure for anybody who was concerned. And then we're in another pristine spot here for Jaden Daniels. If, as you said, Michael Penix, who I do like this week, I think obviously what they were able to do against the Giants last week, they didn't force him to throw. I think what we saw from him was still pretty good. You do worry about, he's a young quarterback with pressure and all of that stuff, and we'll see what happens. But I am in on Penix this week because I do think he's going to be forced to throw, and I think assuming Drake London is healthy, which it seems like he is, that he's got the weapons to do that. Maybe they bench Kyle Pitts and he doesn't have an interception because of that. And so yeah, that's where we are. But this is a pristine spot for Jaden Daniels, and I expect him to have another big game. This is also objectively a good spot for the other Robinson, for Brian Robinson Jr.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, last week was rough, was really, really rough for him. I'm interested in what we see his usage look like coming out of that game.
And we don't know you would hope that this coaching staff, for the time they spent with Brian Robinson, they know what they have in the player and just, chalk up the 2 fumbles and say, because that was the first 2 fumbles he had all year. Like this isn't a Ramondre situation where he's now up to, 7, 8 fumbles on the year. Those are the first 2 fumbles Brian Robinson had all season. He was terrible. It was a bad football game, but now you're at home as a favorite, against a team you can run the football on. This is a spot we would say, yes, we would like a guy like Brian Robinson. And just 3 weeks ago, he torched the Titans in this same, like a similar spot as like a big home favorite. So he has left a lot of meat on the bone, especially you go back to that Saints game a couple weeks ago where he had the 20 touches and didn't really turn them into anything. But I expect them to still have a high workload in this game. I don't think that this coaching, I can't really say I don't know what they're going to do because I don't have any inside information, but I would believe that this coaching staff knows what they have in Brian Robinson and would be able to overlook kind of just last week being just a terrible game.
The Ramondre Stevenson, Drake May backwards pass, like given all of the issues for ball security that he has, that they tried that against the Bills on the goal line. Just like, I don't even, what are we doing? Like, what are we doing? If you listen, so I really like Bill Simmons and Cousin Sal's like Guess the Lines podcast. I think that it's really fun. It might be the only Bill Simmons podcast I listen to throughout the year, but I think it's really fun. And Bill has been like adamant about how good Drake May has been. I don't disagree with him. I think Drake May has been very good. Especially with what is around him, if you kind of like adjust for what's around him on that team, but like Bill hates that coaching staff so much, and it is funny every week to listen to the new ways that they have annoyed him, and that was one that really bothered him, and I'm on his side on that one. I just like, Ramondre can't hold on to the ball. What are we doing? That one was rough.
I actually feel bad for Patriots fans. I feel like they have everything right with Drake May, and then you could start flushing this thing out. But I mean, I just don't know if they have the right guy in charge.
I believe that that's probably a sentiment shared by many Patriots fans. And so we'll have to see where we go. That team could win. Like, how many more wins could that team have this year? 4, 5? Like, what are we talking about here? Like, I don't. They're not good. I'm not even saying that they're good. They traded their best pass rusher, and like their defense is still fine, right? They've got talent over there.
Yeah, they have no offensive
Yeah,
line still.
no offensive line, no wide receivers. Like, it's just like, what are we doing? Prayers up, Drake May. I hope that it works out for you, because I like you. I like watching you. Speaking of Drake May, we do have a question here from Alex. In a bit of a quarterback pickle, because Hurts we're not expecting to play. Options would be Justin Herbert, Drake May, or Bryce Young there. I mean, I do like Young and kind of the situation that he's in,
Mhm.
running more here. You certainly like him. We'll talk about that game here in just a second. I have, been a fan of Drake May, but we don't know about that matchup. I still think here they might not be pushed because going up against the Patriots, but I still think that this is Justin Herbert here. You're just going to feel more comfortable with him would be my guess. Where are you?
I think I would lean Bryce Young because, again, the game environment. I think that Herbert
Sure.
has the best matchup, and you definitely do feel the safest with Herbert. So if you're in a pickle and you just want the safe option, I do think you go with Herbert. But I do think from like a game environment stance, like Bucks Panthers has way more avenues to be like both teams to score in the 20s than Patriots Chargers does.
No, I agree with that. In fact, that's the
Yeah,
next game I wanted to talk about. And I don't even know, like, I kind of started to write, a quietly fun fantasy game. I don't think it's a quietly fun fantasy game. I think if you're paying attention, you know that this is a fun fantasy game here with the Panthers at the Bucks. The Bucks are 8-point favorites. That does throw a little bit of cold water on it from like a Vegas expectations point of
right.
view. But the total's 48 and a half. I mentioned it when I was talking about Young. We've now got Bryce Young, the runner. And he's been, obviously this last week was a big game for him as a runner, but he's been running relatively consistently. The thing about Bryce Young, people have been talking about him having, being playing better than he had been since he's come back to the starting job. And that is 100% true that's what's been happening. He did have a rough game a couple weeks ago, but he has been playing better. It wasn't necessarily, we weren't seeing that from a fantasy perspective still, though, for a lot of that. I think we kind of got that last week. And in this, we saw that a little bit in his last game against Tampa Bay. And with this progression we've seen from him, with Adam Thielen healthy and what we've seen from him and that kind of connection coming back, yeah, I am in on Bryce Young in this game, and just in on this game being fun. I think this is going to be a really fun game from a fantasy perspective.
Yeah, Bryce Young would be like if we were, I don't know if we're like even really doing like week 17 uncut gems, but he would be definitely probably my guy, especially if you had a guy like Jalen Hurts. Him and Drake, he's like basically been on the Drake May plan, like very similar for fantasy. Like they've been very similar fantasy scores. Like you said, they're not really doing a lot like from passing production stance, even though like when you watch them, they're passing more of the eyeball test. But from like a fantasy stance and like a passing point production stance, they're not really putting up a lot of passing points. They're just kind of getting there and the bonus points through their legs. So they've been very similar in that regard. And then the Bucks we know are going to blitz a lot and they give up a lot of rushing production to quarterbacks. Over the past 6 weeks, only Jalen Hurts and Jaden Daniels have a higher scramble rate than Bryce Young. So he's probably going to run a good amount on Sunday, and then the Bucks can give up some production. We know the Bucks offense is going to push 2 for points. So yeah, that game environment definitely is set up to be fun. And we're going to have the re-rise of Bucky Irving again.
My only note on Bucky Irving is Bucky Irving colon smash spot, because this is just, yeah, uh, play Bucky Irving. Like, wherever you would like to play Bucky Irving, play Bucky Irving. This is exactly what we want, the exact environment we want for him as a fantasy play.
Yeah, I mean he came back healthy last week and was back into dominating the backfield in terms of like rushing split. Rashad White played really only on passing outs. I think he only had 3 carries in the game.
Yeah, and then we also have Jalen McMillan as well, which is, interesting. We've seen that role stick, which I was a question that we had when we first saw that first 2 touchdown game. We saw that stick. It didn't, the targets fell off a little bit last week. He still got in the end zone and kind of saved his day. But now we have Sterling Shepard was a DNP on Wednesday. Kate Otten, we still don't know, if he's going to play this week, still a DNP. So I think you feel pretty comfortable right now with where McMillan is from a target perspective, and in this environment, especially if you're just trying to, run doubles with Baker Mayfield. He's the
Mhm.
very obvious one there. And that is also the fun thing about this game from a DFS perspective, is I think you're pretty clear of kind of what you can do with this. If you want to play Baker Mayfield, you play him with Evans and McMillan, and you can run Chuba and Thielen back. And if you want to play Bryce Young, I guess it gets a little bit trickier with that second receiver, who that is. I think Xavier Leggette's probably going to play this week. And so that gets a
But
little
you
bit,
probably don't run
tougher.
doubles with Young anyways, because we just talked about like the
Hope for
passing
rushing.
stuff.
Yeah.
He's only thrown multiple passing touchdowns, I think, twice.
Yeah, exactly. And you're just hoping for rushing at that point, and from him getting there on relatively lower salary. So you just run him with Thielen, and you have Irving on the other side, can Evans. You can play McMillan on the
Yeah,
other side
Bucky.
too. So yeah, it's really easy to get there from a DFS perspective. I'm interested in kind of your perspective. So as I said, I try not to look at ownership projections until like Saturday, because I don't want it to affect me, like how I'm looking at these players. So it's hard for me to know where the public's going with. I don't consume a lot of other fantasy content other than you. You are my fantasy content. Congratulations, Rich. But so I don't know how popular do you think this game will actually be from a DFS perspective?
Oh,
I'm
usually by
interested.
the time we do this show, I've already done my Wednesday show where we're looking at the weekend site and have done like an early peek at ownerships, but we didn't do it for Christmas this week. We're doing it on Friday. So it's like I actually don't have like a grasp on where like initial like optimals even are spitting out for the main slate, because we had
Interesting.
Christmas. We didn't look ahead. We've got the Saturday slate in front of us. So I actually haven't looked either. I would assume though that Bucky Irving is going to be really popular. And I would also assume that if you're using an optimal or something, that Adam Thielen is probably going to pop in those two based on salary and opportunity. I would assume that
Those
those
would be
two
the two.
will be popular.
Yeah, those were the two I was thinking would be very popular as well. But we have Evans coming off a somewhat disappointing game, so maybe you get that in there
Yeah.
a little bit.
And I
That'll be
assume
interesting.
Brian Thomas Jr. I wrote about this last week when because Brian Thomas Jr. has just been in like the core plays article for like a month, and it's the same thing that we do at Chase Brown. He's like literally become Chase Brown, the wide receiver, where Chase Brown got the initial job, and we can all see like, hey, this job exists for him, but they didn't price him up all the way, and like it slowly built up to where like Chase Brown got the 9K, and like that's what we're doing at Brian Thomas Jr. Like he started at like 6K, then he goes to 6.2, because it's like it's literally the Chase Brown plan.
Just play him. Just play him
Yeah.
this week. Like I will have lots of lineups with him and Okonkwo. Like that'll be
This keeps
that'll be a
going.
thing.
I would pump the brakes on Okonkwo this week.
Okay, I'm interested in hearing this now. Why you would pump so because he was going to be my uncut gem last week, and I kind of I pivoted off of it because I'd been doing just so many tight ends. I felt like it was cheating
Ah.
with it. Like I felt like I was cheating with that. This week it would have been Mechie, which didn't work out great, but I was happy
Ooh, Texans.
with kind.
Ooh.
I know,
Ooh.
but hey, but he still
And
got me in like
Beyonce though.
PPR leagues.
That Beyonce performance though.
It saved it. It saved it for sure. What a terrible like I did like I even told my family. I tweeted this out, but I like said this in real life to my family. I said, those games that I kind of neglected y'all to watch a little bit. Yeah, turns out they were dog shit. So I'm sorry about I'm sorry about neglecting y'all to watch these terrible games. But I want to hear your break pump on Okonkwo, because what we've seen now over the last month or something, he has like a 22.5% target share. If you look at him with Mason Rudolph this year, 18.9% target share, 23.7% of his routes he's been targeted on with Rudolph on the field. He only went for 3 catches, 8 yards. I think that was the number against the Jaguars last time, but the Jaguars have been giving fantasy points to tight ends. So I'm very interested in kind of what's your problem? What's your deal, man? I guess that's what I want to say
You
here
you didn't
about
edit this
Okonkwo.
game in the work. You didn't edit this worksheet game.
I did not know.
All right, yeah, because I laid out the stuff like that. Conquo has had his 2 big spike weeks against 2 primary heavy zone-based teams.
Interesting.
He has absolutely horrendous splits against man and zone coverage. Uh,
Interesting.
he leads the team in target rate against zone coverage on the season, 1.7 yards per route run. And against man coverage, he actually, among all wide receivers and tight ends on the team, he has the fewest target rate per route run of any player on the team, 0.4 yards per route run against man coverage. When these teams played, a couple weeks ago. The Jaguars did their things. They are a Jekyll and Hyde, like man coverage zone team. They either play like a lot of cover 2 or a lot of man coverage. And this team just basically lived in man coverage when these teams played the first time. That's why I'm back on the Ridley Express this week for DFS and for and in this game in general. So when these teams played the first time, the Jaguars ran man coverage 42% of the snaps. So I'm looking for more upside here for Ridley than a Okonkwo. And I know everyone's going to play a Okonkwo too. So
yeah, that is certainly to in my calculation about him. Sorry, so I apologize. It will not be Brian Thomas Jr. and Okonkwo will be Brian Thomas Jr. and Calvin Ridley, and we will be blaming Rich when Okonkwo scores
yeah,
2
you
long
can. I
touchdowns.
will say it's a tight end. I always say when people like, I like this tight end, I say play him. Like if you in this climate, like if you like a tight end, but I am not going to get in the way of your tight end play of choice. Like
Perfect. All right, yeah. One more. We'll get out of here. After now we've had this long and extensive conversation about Okonkwo. One more question there in the chat though. Tua or Caleb Williams this week? I'm starting the Seahawks defense if that changes anything. I continue to like what we've gotten from Caleb Williams as a fantasy player
yeah,
recently. With his running ability and the fact that they've been using him there, we've seen him have more success with Tua going up against the Browns. I mean, it's not a bad matchup, but they are playing, outdoor in Cleveland.
just whatever.
Tua, yeah, I'm like, I don't know. I'm on Caleb here. What do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I lean Caleb as well, just for the rushing and the upside. It feels like a very ho-hum Dolphins game, doesn't it?
Yeah, it feels like a game that I will not watch much of, even though we have like
The
6
old
games
Roto
in that
World
early.
days, like if you're not assigned to this game, like you're
We have 2 games in the late slate. It's the second game other than Packers Vikings in the late slate. So I guess I will see more of it than I thought I would. But yeah, I'm not gonna be particularly
I mean, this
excited
Browns
to
team, we
sit
talked
watch
about it
on.
with DTR. Like, it's just not a serious operation. It's just
It's yeah, it's not. You tried to
if
like
Njoku
gaslight me
doesn't
into
play, like
thinking that DTR maybe he's not as bad as he had been, and no, it's not good. It's not good. All right, on that very dour note, let's get out of here. Remember, if you have questions, you can ask Rich about those in our subscriber only chat on Sunday morning. So make sure you're subscribed for that. You'll get an email with a link straight to it. So do that. You can also check out his worksheet previews of every single game. Check out his rankings. If you sign up for our weekly all access package, you also get access to Warren Sharp's betting recommendations. So all of that is available to you. You can get it for 80% off using promo code SHARP80. So make sure you go and check that out. Thank you for listening this far. If you're listening to the podcast, thank you. You can also find us on YouTube. Go to YouTube, search Sharp Football Analysis, subscribe. You get notified when we go live. Warren Sharp will be live tomorrow, for instance. Lots of live content all the way through the playoffs. Rich and I will be with you all the way through the playoffs as well. We appreciate the support, and we'll talk to you next week.